Liberal Forum to this morning's On the Agenda webinar. My name is Lauren Mason, I'm Project Coordinator at ELF, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's discussion about the US presidential elections and what that means for Europe. I think it's fair to say that this event has been dominating all of our news feeds for the last fortnight, if not a bit longer. But it's now time to take a bit of a step back and see and ask sort of what that all means for Europe and for us. So I'm very happy to welcome all of our panelists this morning and our moderator, Beatriz Ríos. So Beatriz, I would hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Larry. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. First of all, let me tell you a few housekeeping rules. This webinar is being streamlined on our Facebook page as well. And if you want to ask some questions to our panelists, you can always leave them in the Q&A section of this Zoom call. The US elections definitely have an impact on our newsfeed, but also in our political spectrum. We have seen reactions for all the EU leaders to the results after 4 years of the presidency of Donald Trump. That has created a very an extreme tension between both sides of the Atlantic. We might have a change with the arrival of President-elect Joe Biden, but will that have a real impact on the transatlantic relations, or are there issues where the US and the EU still are not on the same page? To discuss those issues, from trade to fighting climate change to security, we have today an amazing panel. I'd like to give the floor first to Liesje Schreinemacher, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe group. Please, Liesje, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Beatriz and Lauren, for this introduction. And thank you for inviting me here today. It is a great pleasure to speak at the European Liberal Forum. And to shortly introduce myself, I am a member of the US delegation in the European Parliament, and I'm also a shadow rapporteur in INTA, the International Trade Committee, on the US-EU relations. So it's a subject near to my heart, also personally. I think I'm one of many that followed the elections very closely. It was striking to see that the US elections were followed by so many from home all over the world. And I think, well, obviously many people have always been fascinated with the US, but it's also that people were hoping for a change and for more predictability and more certainty in our world affairs. And especially with this ongoing pandemic and the pressure that it poses on our economies, we would really benefit from a US that really invests in a multilateral system. So when we're talking about the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization, NATO, Paris Agreement, these are all things that we are also looking at the US to work together on. And when we talk about trade, this week has been full of developments. We had to deal with a situation from the past before. So on Monday, our trade ministers from the European Union came together and decided on tariffs in a WTO dispute on the Boeing Airbus dispute that led to tariffs of on products worth of billions of euros from the US and the EU. Unfortunately, we had to do this because we tried to come to an agreement with the US, but we had not succeeded in this as well. And that is also why we're looking at Biden right now in order to find a negotiated agreement as soon as possible, because businesses and consumers are hurt on both sides of the Atlantic, and that should not be. That's not in anyone's favor. So we're also eagerly looking towards a new relationship with the Biden administration and explore new areas of cooperation. When we talk about digital trade, setting new standards for AI, for example, artificial intelligence, but also on conformity assessments. So that is that you don't have to do research on certain products on both sides of the Atlantic when you are trading goods. And but we do also have to keep in mind that Biden will not be change everything like this, because, for example, there are tariffs in place that have been in place for years, and he will not just alleviate them in his first year. I don't believe that. He has also said that prior to even thinking of any new future trade agreements, he first wants to strengthen the position of his own middle class. So he's really looking first into towards internal affairs before engaging in any big trade talks in the near future. And obviously, it's very good news that he has already dedicated himself to signing up to the Paris Agreement. Again, I think this is very important for the European Union, and this is a very good step forward. But he also, I think when we look at the election results, he has a big group. 70 million people did vote for Trump, and he wants to be a president of all American people. So he really has to take that part of the country into account when he proposes policies. And I think even this past week, we've heard also from the left wing of his own party that he will have to take these into account as well. So he will have a very big challenge ahead. But I think that all around Europe, people are hopeful and optimistic about our relationship in the future, the coming years. But we should not think that everything changes just like this, because I do not believe that it will. And I think that it's also good that we have become more conscious as a European Union these past years. Trump has forced us to do it. But I think that is a good sign. For example, when you look at NATO, it's good that as Europe, we cannot only look at the United States to cover our asses, so to speak, when it comes to our defense and our security. And we do have to invest more in defense, in our defense capabilities. And Trump has said it in very rude ways, but I think that he was right on that point. And when it comes to geopolitical atmosphere and also in defense, we will have to be more forward, more conscious, and less reliant on third countries. So that's my introduction for now, and I look forward to more debate with the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Liesje. I think you have pointed out to many issues that are going to be very important for the discussion today. The fact that it's not because Joe Biden was elected that all the problems that the US and the EU have are going to disappear. And also, I think we find a very particular context because we were hoping to have a very smooth transition into a different administration, but we're now in the middle of a pandemic. It's very important for the Biden administration to take care of the domestic issues as well. And it's no longer a priority to rebuild the relationship with the foreign partners. It is in the agenda, but it's going to take some time. And it also impacts the economic relations that we might have with the US. To talk about the economic relations with the US, I am sure that Dominic Boucsein, he has a lot to say about that because he's the head of international trade and foreign policy at EUROCHAMBER. So please, Dominic, you have the floor.
Thanks, Beatriz. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And let me also give a bit my take on that. As Liesje already said, I'm also guilty of having spent probably more time than I should glued to CNN over the past week, trying to follow as those results come in. But I think now it's pretty clear with Joe Biden as president-elect and as many others, I think that gives us a chance that we actually must use to reboot our transatlantic relations. Transatlantic economic relations in particular. Things have been fairly rocky as of late. But however, as it stands, Joe Biden will be without the control of both houses of Congress. And I think it will come down to this runoff in Georgia in January for the remaining 2 Senate seats. And from what I'm reading, the Republicans will at least, or are likely to get 1, which means they will be in control of the Senate still, but let's see. So this will probably mean that a gradual approach will be pursued by the new president, and he won't be able to pursue let's say an aggressive agenda on domestic issues like environmental policy or the like. Also on trade, things might not be radically different, as Liesje alluded to that. I think Biden has promised to boost US manufacturing, strengthen the Buy America, and impose also taxes on companies wanting to offshore. So that doesn't sound all too different from the approach we had before. And as was said, I think that this was a very narrow victory. So I think Trumpism is far from dead. And we might still see some form of Trumpism actually on the ballot in 2024. So I think, in other words, the country remains split, the way I see it. So I think we must have a realistic, pragmatic, but yet positive approach now to what we can do in the upcoming 4 years. But I think one thing remains certain, despite and regardless of the elections, and that is that the transatlantic economic relationship is enormous, and it's probably in the category of too big to fail. Now, around 10 million people on both sides of the water depend on the transatlantic economic relationship. And essentially, this is a relationship that is built on investment. Our investors in the EU account for roughly 68% of the 4.3 trillion invested in the United States on an historic cost basis. And that is around 4 times the level of comparable investments in Asia. But it's also often overlooked the digital dimension, which is also hugely important. North America and Europe both generate around 75% of all the digital content for internet users worldwide, and 55% more data flow through transatlantic cables than in trans-Pacific routes. And also on the let's say the green transition, despite all the rhetoric and despite the US pulling out of the Paris Accord under the previous administration, both companies on both sides have actually been continuing to do business and cooperating. In fact, EU companies accounted for over half of all FDI greenfield projects in the US energy economy. And US companies have also been responsible in a large chunk for the long-term renewable energy agreements here in Europe. So actually this just goes to show that our economic investment ties are there, but I think there's still a lot of, let's say, untapped economic potential. And I think where do we go from here? I see we have three avenues in my view where we can strengthen those relationships. And that's the bilateral one, the multilateral one, and let's say the common challenges which we face. But I think the first issue which we need to work on is trust, because this transatlantic house and the transatlantic economy is built essentially on trust over years and years and on business partnerships. And this is something, the first thing we should restore. In terms of the bilateral agenda, and Liesje alluded to a lot of things happening this week. Let's say different opinions on those, but let's say I think the first thing we need to do is resolve the tit-for-tat tariffs resulting from the WTO cases on Boeing and Airbus. The consequences of these tariffs are harmful to our producers, to our economic operators, some of which are not, of course, many of which are not even in the aircraft industry. There's still, of course, the unjustified US tariffs on steel and aluminum, the threat on cars. And I think we still have on the table, let's say, a reduction for all industrial tariffs, which I think is something we should see with the Biden administration, how much we can move on that, because there's still some tariff peaks that would be, let's say, useful to get eliminated. Then we have, of course, and with Inter voting this week, the so-called lobster deal that went through. I think that is a good positive step, but I think it can only be a step towards something more ambitious on tariffs. So let's see how much we can do with the Biden administration on that regard. But especially for small, medium-sized enterprises, a lot of the barriers are behind the border. And we have issues on conformity assessment. We have a very good practice on the mutual recognition agreement on pharmaceuticals, on good manufacturing practices. And actually there, I think we should see whether we can expand that to vaccines, which is something that is very relevant now in the COVID context. And we actually see a very good transatlantic partnership these days with the German firm BioNTech partnering with Pfizer towards a vaccine that could really change things according to the studies that came out. I think on the WTO, just very briefly, we have, let's say, a new impetus. You know, I think Biden administration will see the EU more as a partner than a threat. So I think we can work together on a multilateral rules-based trade. But there are also many issues on common challenges we must face. And a key area there is rebalancing our relationship with China. And I think the Biden administration has already said he's very willing to work with the EU on that. And I think other than that, we have a lot of room for cooperation on standard setting and synergies in our connectivity strategies. So I think there's a lot of stuff there that we can and should do in those 4 years, because this is really a crucial relationship for European business.
Thanks a lot, Dominic. I think it was very interesting that you pointed out to this, the same that Liesje said about the fact that this is not going to change everything a minute after Joe Biden takes over the presidency of the US, especially when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade, because some of them have been there for quite a while. Some of the issues when it comes to trade between the US and the EU were there before, even with the Obama administration. It's nothing new. So the question, and I will leave this for the discussion later, but my question for you would be, how optimistic are you about the future relation with the US, taking all this into consideration? To what extent we're going to see a negotiation very swiftly when it comes to the tit for tat tariffs between on Boeing and Airbus? To what extent we can see a negotiation over the aluminum and steel tariffs that have been there for quite some time and that were very hurtful for the European industry? And to what extent we can see the threat over cars staying there, or is something that it was just a Trump administration tool to push the EU for a trade agreement that was never actually negotiated in the end because the parties were not able to move? But I will leave this for the discussion later. I would like to give the floor now to Ricardo Silvestre, who is an international officer for the social liberal movement in Portugal and the host of the European Liberal Forum's podcast series, Liberal Europe Podcast. Ricardo was in the US during the transition between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Very different transition this time between administrations, but I'm sure he has a lot to say about these elections and the impact for Europe. Please, Ricardo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Beatriz. And I want to start by thanking the European Liberal Forum for trusting me in to give a small contribution to this debate. It's a privilege to share the panel with Liesje and Dominic, and thank you also, Beatriz, to moderating. I have a small presentation because the way that I prepared this talk, it's to make a reflection. What can we learn for what we're seeing happening in the United States right now? And I thought about more at the political level and social level, and Liesje and Dominic already did a tremendous job talking about economics, but I'll go a little more into what we can learn regarding the process and the dangers of this process. So the first thing that I should say that I'm very happy that I was wrong on my podcast with Professor Daniela Mello from Boston University, that there was no violence on the streets, at least not yet. Let's hope that it continues that way. But like our American friends say, we're not out of the woods yet. Why? Because the lack of cooperation, the refusal to accept democratic results, the unwillingness to have a peaceful transition, what we're seeing right now in the United States. I think we Europeans, we may think that it will never happen in Europe, but we also thought it would never happen in the United States. So how is this happening? And I think that it has to do with having a propaganda arm with you, to have a political party that totally collapsed, and then to have a group of voters that will stick with you no matter what you do. Because undoubtedly, and we all know, it's been 4 years of just chaos, bad policies, problems, one after the other, but still people voted for President Trump. And we know this because as I talk right now, he has already around 73 million votes. It could have been more of a blue wave. In that case, if Vice President Biden had won Florida, Texas, Ohio, we could have been having a different conversation, even if I'm sure that even if he had those states, President Trump would keep saying that the election was stolen. So how can we fit this into a wider narrative that could be of interest for us Europeans? If 72 million people voted for President Trump, it's because these people have a set of beliefs that we in Europe, and as we see populists getting more and more results, we need to be careful about. And I'm sure that these 3 points that I gather from, reading the literature and reading pundits, they not include everyone. I understand that. There are people that I'm sure have, economic concerns, foreign policy concerns, but this 3 group of people in particular, I want to bring to our attention because we as liberals, we need to be able to reach these people. And these people in the United States, but it can become in Europe also, voted for that party, Republican Party, because they will not vote for any other party as bad as the governance can be. The other reason is just that people are illiberal. And we've been listening to about illiberal democracies in Europe, and we can go into that during this discussion. And I lived in the United States. There are racists, there are xenophobic, there are misogynist, nativistic people, they're homophobic, they're isolationists. Those people, they exist. And I'm sure it was a quite significant part of the voters. And then finally, these people live in ideological bubbles. We know all about this, Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and 4chan, something that we can go into also. So how can we break these barriers, either if they're ideological, if they're cultural, if they're informational? Now, Liesje and Dominic already did a tremendous job talking about the economic. I would go into a little less detail, and I'm thinking that a Biden-Harris administration, and I want to say publicly how happy I am that the United States have a vice president-elect, which is a woman. So that is already a very positive thing. But what I'm hoping is that more of a full support for the idea of the European Union as a project. For example, the ambassador to the United States to the European Union was a disaster. A support for democracy, and I already see some movement in eastern part of Europe, like Hungary and Poland, and our friends from Visegrad Insight, for example, are talking about this already, how Poland and Hungary need to get ready to have a United States that demands more democracy and more liberal values. And then this is a point that I think it's interesting to add, which is a stand against Russian aggression, Ukraine, the Baltic area, a return to the Paris Agreement, a return to the World Health Organization, and a cooperation against the pandemic, like Dominic said, for example, with the vaccine. And then a recommitment to NATO, again, sanctions against Russia, a new START treaty, a new INF treaty, and also a full support for Ukraine, which is also something of interest for us here in the European Union. So that is my contribution. And again, I thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Ricardo. I very much appreciated that you mentioned the question of democracy and the question of the electorate that vote for Donald Trump. Because I recently read an interview with Danny Roddick, and he was explaining how his perception of what was happening in the US is very much what you were talking about, the fact that somehow there is a very large group of people that have a completely different perception of reality than half of the other country, and that completely broke the norms of the political system that we have taken for granted. And indeed, it's very important for the EU, this in terms of the impact for the developments that we are seeing in Europe, in Hungary, in Poland, in Slovenia, in different countries that have their own issues when it comes to upholding democracy and rule of law, and therefore having a partner on the other side of the Atlantic that is very much in favor of preserving democracy is way more important than someone who is so disrupted as Donald Trump was. Also, when it comes to Brexit, and this is a topic that we haven't touched upon, but I'm definitely going to bring this into the conversation. And I was thinking that probably a big change that we are going to see with the Biden administration is just simply that even though there might be issues where we do not agree, the approach is going to be completely different. I'm thinking about this picture. I don't remember if it was this G20 or the G7, where Trump was just sit down, all like not willing to cooperate and to engage with the other leaders. that's what Trump was about. He had his own perception of reality, his own set of rules, his own way to behave, and he didn't engage with the leaders. Now we're going to see a big difference of that, and I think that's very important. I'd like maybe to touch upon first on the questions that Ricardo brought into the conversation about what can the EU learn about what happened in the US, the developments that we have seen over the past 6 years, because the Trump administration didn't arrive there by chance. And what can the EU learn from that in terms of how liberal democracy has been put in question, how we are seeing a partner on the other side of the Atlantic questioning its own democratic system, its own electoral system, something that if we would have seen in any other country in the world, we'll be already putting sanctions on the table. So what can Europe learn from this, and what can we do to avoid that from happening in Europe that we are seeing very worrying developments? Maybe, Liesje, you want to take the floor in this one.
Yes, thank you. I think, well, populism, as you said, rightfully so, is something that we've been dealing with in the European Union for a while now as well. Also the Netherlands, I think for the past 20 years, populism has been on the rise. And I think that one of the lessons that we should learn from this, or a takeaway, is that you shouldn't exclude people on either side of the political spectrum too much. So you should always try to engage in a dialogue and never just discard people and say, you know, they have no idea what they're talking about, they don't know, they're dumb, or they don't know, they don't understand politics, or they're just racists. That doesn't help, because then their sense of not being heard, of not being included in the society, in economy, festers, and that turns into a big ball of being aggrieved and being not heard, and it reinforces itself at some point. And I think that is how Trump still gets to be able to get more than 70 million votes at this point. So I think that is also something that we should be very perceptive and very, we should really take lessons from that. Don't discard people, because it will turn as a boomerang in your face. And I'm happy that Biden is already saying, I want to be president of everybody, because that the country is so divided, and the same is in the European Union. We have the same problems. So I think he did a good job. He had a tremendous speech, and I think that would be something that we should be doing as well.
How do you see this, Ricardo? You were mentioning these different aspects of the changes that we've seen in the US that led to the election of Donald Trump first, and then to this divide in the society. How do you see this in Europe?
This is a great point that Liesje did, and I would like to reinforce it, and that is the tribalism of politics that we're seeing, not only in the United States, but if this thing starts coming to Europe, then it starts getting more and more difficult to have that dialogue that Liesje was talking about. And we see this in the United States, and I would like to go into it, Beatriz, because you brought that up, and it's really, really important, and that is, how does that dialogue happen, for example, online? And this is something that is really, really close to me, because I've been studying this for a long time. And I think some of the polarization, and I mentioned on that point, and I think the European Union is doing some really good steps going in that direction. It's try to rein in at least a little bit what's happening online, on Facebook, on Twitter. This algorithm selection of who do I listen to and what do I see, this thing is just pulling us apart. And exactly like Liesje was saying, if you have a constant barrage of these people are racist, these people are xenophobic, these people are nativists, you don't have any opportunity to enter that kind of system and then try to at least make sense of a kind of joint work for things to get better. So we need to have a shared reality, and then we need to have ways of communicating. And I think Europe, in that particular, European Commission is doing a good job, and I hope we continue in that direction, because And just to finish, Beatriz, one thing is ideological barriers. Those ones, that's the political debate. The other thing is that what Liesje was saying is that people are not talking to each other anymore. So I hope that in Europe, we are able to stop that, at least what we're seeing in America.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's indeed very important to keep that dialogue alive. I'm going to move slightly into another part of the conversation because we have limited time and there are a lot of topics that I would like to touch upon. One of the questions as well, and I think that this related to what we were saying, is that somehow Donald Trump has disregarded completely rules at all different levels, at national level, but also on international level. At international level, he has rejected multilateralism at many different levels, from the nuclear deal with Iran to the Paris Agreement to the WTO. The WTO has been a big issue during this administration. It was an issue before because the blockage that we've seen in the WTO was there under the Obama administration, but it has definitely worsened during these past few years. So I'd like to turn to Dominic to talk about this. How do you see the reform of the WTO coming together under the Biden administration? Are you more optimistic towards this? And maybe we can build up from there and talk a little bit more about trade. But yeah, let's talk first about the WTO reform.
Right. No, thanks, Beatriz. I think yeah, you're right. I think we're in a pretty grim state in terms of the WTO. I think over the past 4 years, certainly there were numerous attacks by the current U.S. administration on the WTO, and especially on the dispute settlement mechanism, and in particular, of course, with the dysfunctionality of the appellate body, and that is, of course, very grave. I mean, you know, international business thrives on predictability, and a key element of predictability is also the proper enforcement of rules. So without having proper enforcement or adjudication at the WTO, which is really one of the great achievements of this organization, we might end up in a situation where it's just the rule of the strongest, and that in any case inserts predictability and uncertainty. And I mean, the EU has done a terrific job to kind of fill that void, but I hope in the meantime, I hope we can get back to the appellate body as it was with the Biden administration. I think there were issues there, but I think they can be resolved in a dialogue, and that was mentioned before. I think there's a need again to engage. There's a need to discuss. There's a need to find compromise, to listen to each other, and I think with the Biden administration that would certainly be easier. But at the same time, there are many issues at the WTO which still need to be addressed. You know, there needs to be an improvement of the notification transparency in terms of subsidies has been deplorable. You know, we need like new rules that kind of can cater to the reality of business that are facing nowadays. So, you know, there's a lot of things that we also should do in terms of, let's say, a comprehensive reform in order to really make that rules fit for the current realities which our entrepreneurs are already living. You know, one of the key issues as well is digital trade and e-commerce and all these things. You know, we're having this debate now virtually, and I think COVID has really brought to the forefront the importance of the digital economy, and you know, having a global set of rules would be the best way to go forward, instead of, you know, each breaking into its own little sphere. But there are many other things that we can do at the WTO. We should do. You know, there's the issue on fisheries and other areas where we can also move on a multilateral basis to kind of encourage green products and services. So there's a lot of room there which we should use, and I think at the end of the day, with the Biden administration, we're having someone, I think, who's more willing to engage and listen. And I think the president-elect Biden has made it very clear that he's very much looking forward also to rebuild some of those multilateral partnerships.
Thank you, Dominic. It's very interesting because you mentioned both the appellate body and digital trade, and it's we have seen the EU being way more assertive over the past few years, precisely because of the vacuum that the US left. I wanted to ask Liesje about this. How do you see the role of the European Union when it comes particularly to trade, where we have seen that assertive approach that we've been lacking for many, many years because the US wasn't there, and to what extent we're going to see the EU keep on having that role, even though we might see a change on the other side of the Atlantic?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. I think it's good that the European Union has become more assertive in this sense. And we've also shown it this past Monday by enforcing tariffs, even though I'm really not really a fan of that, because obviously both sides are just hurting by these tariffs, and we should really get into a negotiated agreement as soon as possible. But in order to even get the Americans at the table and be serious about talk, sometimes you need to have a strong stance and a firm position, and I think that these tariffs allow for that. And I think it's good that, I agree with everything Dominic has said on the WTO reform, so I'm not going to repeat that. Obviously, this has been a problem during the Obama administration as well. So again, we should not think that now Biden is in place that everything will just magically swift. There have been many good proposals on the table by the European Union, but the US just has refused to really engage on these in a serious manner. So just to get the US engaged in a serious manner, I think we do have to take a strong stance and be more assertive. And I think it's good that the European Union is doing that right now.
Thank you, Liesje. How do you see this? Yeah, I was going to jump on you, Ricardo. How do you see this?
Very quickly, I'm not a specialist on trade and economics, but one thing.
You have a lot to say.
But Dominic mentioned that, and that is there is one more factor that we haven't yet completely determined, which is who controls the Senate in Congress. So even if President Biden can have a lot of power with executive orders, there's still got to be some negotiation between the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then from that to the exterior. So those runoff elections in Georgia are very, very, very important in January.
Thanks, Ricardo. I'm going to stick a little bit more to trade for a little while, and then I promise I will jump into a more general topic. But I wanted to talk about the question of tariffs and the question of bilateral trade that we have seen a lot on the table over the past few days. When it comes to tariffs, how optimistic are you that with the Biden administration, there can be a negotiation both on the Boucsein and Airbus question and on the steel and aluminium that have been there for quite some time, hurting very much the European industry? Maybe, Liesje, you wanted to jump in on this one?
Yes, well, I think that Dominic has just mentioned it in his introduction. This week is the first deal that has been approved by the European Parliament in 20 years that focuses on tariff reduction. So we are, even though it's about a small amount, it's about lobsters going from the US and lighters and parts of lighters going to the US. But I mean, even though it's about 100 million euros, which if you set it off to the Airbus Boeing case, it's peanuts. But it is a step and a signal, a positive signal, that we are willing to engage in lowering tariffs. And I think that's also the case from the US side, that they're willing to discuss it. I think that when it comes to steel and aluminium, as I said before, I don't think that Biden will eliminate these. For example, a few weeks ago, the US has also imposed anti-dumping measures on steel, which hit especially German companies and other European companies very hard. Now it's 300% tariffs have to be paid on steel being imported into the US. That is a really high number, and hopefully Biden will change that, but I'm not sure that, I mean, he's only starting in January, and then before anything happens on that, I think so. I'm relatively optimistic that we will engage in a more positive way, but to see clear results, that will take some time.
What do you think about this, Dominic? Do you see any results coming up in the short term, or we'll have to wait?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, and I fully agree with Liesje, I think this will be gradual. We won't see enormous changes from day one on these questions. I think Biden has made it clear that he sees, let's say, a key to U.S. to restoring, in his view, the U.S. competitiveness goes through boosting, let's say, domestic issues, boosting, let's say, and tackling domestic problems. So I think that will be his focus. As Ricardo said, I think this will also depend a lot on the Senate, of course. If things go the other way in Georgia and the Democrats will be able to control the Senate, then of course that will be very different, because then with, let's say, a control of both houses, that will give him a lot more leeway to move, and I think that might change the scenario. But overall, I think we can get there. I think we can get there, and I think we should always, while being realistic, also be ambitious on these things. I mean, there's a lot of really untapped economic potential across the Atlantic, which we should see. I mean, as I said, the lobster deal, so-called, is a good step forward. I think we had some voices in the parliament that were questioning it before, but I think it's a good and positive step. And as Liesje said, that we're engaging on this. But of course, this is also on an MFN basis, and I think we can see what we'll do together with the US. I mean, there is, as I mentioned, the industrial tariffs on the table, and a lot of, as I said, a lot of issues which we should also focus on. And what's key to business is see where we can cooperate also on the regulatory front when it comes to new technologies with the United States, because it's always easier, let's say, to tackle and try to align our views with future regulation rather than it is removing it, or not removing, but like kind of trying to find common ground on existing one. And I think these are really some key technologies of the future. If you think of AI, if you think of automated driving, quantum computing, all these kind of things, which will be hugely important to our economy as we move forward, and where we really need transatlantic leadership. And I think also in like places like international standard setting bodies and the like. So that we must really push and on all sides, because this is something, an opportunity which we have, which we must seize, and to which our competitiveness, our long-term competitiveness here in Europe and in America depends on. On Boeing Airbus, yeah, I think the as I mentioned, the key there, I think, is de-escalation and trying to find a negotiated outcome. I mean, we will not be, I think, in 10 years, and not even now, the only ones producing civil aircraft. So I think we should also look a bit more long-term and see that actually together we can have transatlantic leadership when it comes to subsidies on civil aircraft. So I hope on all sides a long-term vision prevails.
Thank you a lot for that, Dominic. One of the things that you mentioned was the question of digital transformation, and this is something that has been very much on the agenda for the European Commission, and it's something that they would like to address with the Biden administration, which leads me also to the question of what you were saying about digital. It also the same for the climate change, right? That there are some topics where we need to build partnerships, because there is no other way that we can actually regulate and that we can push for regulation at the international level. I wanted to talk about this dichotomy when we have, on the one hand, we need the EU to be more assertive, but then at the same time, we need to establish partnerships, and therefore it is good that we have a change in the US administration for someone who is more engaged. And maybe Ricardo, you can jump on this one about how do you see the role of the EU under the Biden administration? To what extent we need to be more assertive, but then at the same time to engage more at the international level, just because this is the world we live in, where we have a multilateral system with different partners that are very much strong and that they have a role to play as well.
That's a great question, because Biden can have one or two options. Either he goes with the team that he worked with during the Obama administration, and then the relationship with the European Union will be a little bit of the status quo we had while we had President Obama in power, or then he goes a little more into those kind of Wilsonian values of America, which is, we want Europe to be a union. We believe in a democratic process. We believe in building up a European project, so we will help. And of course, and as Dominic said, and Liesje said better than I do, it's not going to be overnight. It's going to take a lot of resistance. The question of the control of the Senate, it's very important, because Republicans may try to destroy a Biden administration, even if it's against their own benefits, because they benefit from all the commerce between European Union and the United States. But I don't know, the state that the Republican Party is right now, I don't know if they even will go in what is the most obvious, which is more commerce and more proximity. So I think that Biden will go a little more into those values, those democratic values that he holds. Obama was more of a pragmatic line. I think Biden will be more open-hearted and let's work together with our European allies. I hope so, and I believe that.
Sorry, thank you for that. You would like to?
Oh, there's a good question. I'm going to throw it to you, but this question I would like to go into.
Of course, I will read it to you and you can jump straight away. So we have a question from Alexander de Normandie. He mentioned, so talking about the information bubbles, what can we expect and learn from the election of canon members to the Congress? Maybe Ricardo, you want to?
I'll be quick. This is one of the most scary developments in the US politics in the last, let's say, 6 years. First of all, it was President Obama is not from the United States. And then it was we have, all kinds of Democrats being too extreme, too socialist. So this thing just built up. And then we had, of course, the Tea Party. And now we have QAnon. And this is completely insanity. And the fact that representatives are being elected, like Taylor Greene, that she was elected to be a member of Congress, and another member of Congress, which is a neo-Nazi, that he of course, he doesn't say so, but he went to visit Eagle's Nest, where Hitler had his summer home. So you guys can imagine, if Trump continues to poison the system and these people keep getting elected, how the Congress and even the Senate is going to be in 4 or 5 years. This is really, really, really scary. And I think that it's something for us Europeans, and Liesje was saying about that, about us also making pressure in the United States. And one of the pressures that we can have at the first level is to try to give a little bit of rationality and a little bit of common sense, European common sense, to the United States, and try to, at least I do that personally, it is to try to connect with those people that are electing this kind of completely insane solutions for government, and say, hey, that doesn't work. We have the experience in Europe. We've been through that. We know that this kind of craziness does not work for government. So I'm hoping that with more and more examples of this kind of people getting into the system and then either being completely, overwhelmed or then adapting, which we saw in Europe, some far-right parties, either they are in government and they adapt, or then we just have to, try to contain them. So it's an open question, and it's a very good one.
Actually, about that, and maybe Liesje, you would like to jump on this one. We have seen people like that elected to the European Parliament. We recently have a member of the Greek delegation who was accused of being part of a criminal organization and who has conducted even assassinations in Greece. We do have a problem in Europe with this as well. How do we address this question in Europe, and how how do we see this happening, especially when it comes to the far right that Ricardo was mentioning? What do we do about these political parties? Because we have seen that in some countries they have been completely evicted from the public sphere. They have been ignored by the media. They have been disregarded completely to make sure that they do not have a platform so that they don't get elected. In other countries, we have seen, as Ricardo was mentioning, being part of the government. So how do you see this as a European politician coming from the Netherlands, where you have far right as well? What do we do about this?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure if I have the answer completely for you, because this is something that we in the Netherlands have been struggling with in the European Parliament as well. We have the group ID with a lot of nationalist politicians, and yeah, you can even say of some of them are racist, and it's really difficult. So, for example, when they are proposing something in the legislation, do you support it because you are, yeah, you can agree with the content, or do you just say, no, we're gonna ignore you completely, which also can add fuel to the fire. And as I said before, it festers and then it just grows. And this is something that in the Netherlands we've been also dealings, for example, Geert Wilders in between 2010 and 2012, he was part of a sort of minority government which could only exist with his support, and it went well for 2 years. Well, it went okay, and then all of a sudden his populist feeling came back again, and then everything collapsed, and now he's on the sideline again yelling, and now he's making sure that he won't be in the government ever, so he won't have to carry that responsibility, and he can just keep yelling on the sidelines. So I'm not sure I have the silver bullet on this one. It's by trial and error these past few years, and if you have the answer, please let me know.
I wish I would. I wanted to move now into another side of the US-EU relations, and it's foreign affairs, security, everything that relates to the global sphere, where we have seen as well many changes over the past few years because of the attitude that we've seen from the Trump administration. There is a question in the chat about this from Gia Janieri. He said that there need to be more attention to the South Caucasus, and especially to Georgia, which could be a very good partner for the EU, and Biden might be more active there. We remember his strong position, but also weak position of Obama in that region that allowed Russia to behave like a hooligan. So how do you see, first of all, how do you see the changes in when it comes to foreign affairs with the Biden administration, and again, a more assertive role that the EU might need to have, even though we see a change in the US, and in particular in when it comes to the influence of Russia in the Caucasus region? I don't know who wants to take the floor first. Maybe Ricardo, I see you're very eager.
Yeah, that's a great point, Beatriz, because I think that right now, we are already having conversations with a Biden administration. And that is what happened in the last 4 years, particularly with Vladimir Putin having Donald Trump as, even if it is unwilling agent, but to try to break out the Western alliances, to try to, have Ukraine being one of the points of conflict, Georgia, Belarus, all this, I think the Biden administration is going to enter, and they're going to enter strong. And just one last point, because there's this, and I follow them closely, there's this team of international relation people that were in the Obama administration at the Department of State. And these people are just waiting for the moment to try to push back against Moscow and against the Kremlin and say, no, what you guys gained in the last 4 years, we're going to push it back again with the European Union. And the European Union will be smart to catch that and also be assertive to our neighbors at the East.
And I'm going to jump on this one and maybe ask Liesje about it, because we had an event on the agenda a couple of weeks ago about the EU-Russia relations. And one of the questions that we were talking about is how divided the EU is actually on the Russia question. We have different approaches from France, from Germany, but also from the Eastern countries, from the Nordic countries. How do you see this? Because not even the EU has a strong approach when it comes to Russia, because there are different interests within the Union.
Yes, I think that's you're quite right. We do have a difference of opinions on how to deal with Russia. I think obviously Eastern European states still have a fresh memory of what it was like to live under Russian ruling. So they have a different stance on this. And also when you're talking about transatlantic relations, really look to the US in order for their protection when it comes to that. One of the proposals that you hear a lot in Brussels, and I think would be good, is that when it comes to foreign affairs and, for example, sanctions, that we should not take a unanimous stand, but quality majority voting should suffice. And I think when it comes to countries such as Russia, this is the only way that we could really have a strong geopolitical voice as the European Union. So that would be one of the solutions to this problem.
Thanks a lot, Liesje. One of the questions when it comes to the EU being more assertive is actually this. We cannot have a united approach if we rely on unanimity, because there is never going to be unanimity, because every country has different interests. We're getting close to the end of this webinar, and I would like to ask all the panelists to give one round of comments, and I would like you to tell me, what do you expect from the US-EU relations under the Biden administration? Very quickly, what are you looking at over the next few months, but also over the next 4 years? And I'd like to start with Dominic, that has been very silent for a little while. So please, Dominic, you have the floor.
Thank you, Beatriz. No, it's a very interesting discussion, and just in the final remarks, also as Ricardo and Liesje was saying on the debate and what is needed, I think also from the business community, I think we're very much interested in an informed debate. I mean, we're not politicians, we're not getting into that, but we can produce some facts, and we can put them out there and try to help for an informed debate. And I think that is what is ever more needed. Really an informed debate, and also with the US, of course, among partners. And I think this is what I would expect the most: a partnership, again, and a realization of the value of allies. That is, I think, a cornerstone. And as I mentioned initially, the first thing I think we must do is to rebuild the trust again that to a certain degree has been lost in the last 4 years. Because the trust is really the fundamental on which this house is built, on which we can move forward. And I think this is the first thing I think we should very much be working on both sides. And then I really do hope that, you know, over the last 4 years, sometimes you had the impression that instead of creating more opportunities for our businesses, you start to create less. And I think this is something which we must now urgently reverse and really start to create, where can we create more opportunities, and where can we actually make those happen in a realistic manner, so that it actually translates to tangible results in the next 4 years. And I would put, and this also relates to a bit on your foreign policy question, I would say one of the key values of the transatlantic relationship will be some part, of course, what we do bilaterally, but a huge part of the added value will what we do together to address common challenges and global problems together in different arenas, whether this is in Asia, whether this is what we're doing in Africa, whether in the Middle East. There's a lot of room where we can cooperate together, and I think this is a real value of the transatlantic relationship, which under a Biden administration is, let's say, closer to reality again. But I would say let's start with rebuilding trust, and then let's deliver some tangible results as well for businesses on both sides, because look out there, the crisis is really battering companies on both sides. And what we need urgently is growth and really creating opportunities for people also to have a job and be employed and creating futures. So I would say that.
Thank you, Dominic. Building trust to create opportunities. I think it's definitely key both at diplomatic and economic level. Maybe Ricardo, you would like to jump in?
I have one sentence. I have two big loves in my life, two big passions. One is United States of America, and the other one is European Union. I'm a European and also an American. So to answer your question, Beatriz, I'm waiting for the United States to go back to their proper place in the world order and to have a very, very close and very fruitful relationship with the other great bloc, which is European Union, and together to make a better world.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we have more chances of having a better world together with the Biden administration that we definitely had with the Trump administration. Liesje, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much up to my fellow panelists. I agree with both of them in also saying that we should really reinforce our partnership again and find each other again, whether it comes on to trade or defense or geopolitical issues. I do think that we should keep in mind that the world has changed entirely. And it is also good that the European Union has become less reliant on the US, even whether they wanted to or had to. And I think a word that has not been mentioned this whole panel, first time in a panel that it has not been mentioned, is strategic autonomy of the European Union. And I think it's also good to build on that and be equals in our partnership. So really be on a equal footing in that. But thank you.
Equally in a partnership, building trust, changing the world. I think we have beautiful messages to send at the end of this webinar for the US-EU relations. I would like to thank Dominic, Ricardo, and Liesje, and I'm gonna give back the floor to Lauren for that last remark. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Beatriz. And as actually you mentioned it, I think Biden's election is definitely a welcome change for Europe, but indeed we can't expect that everything will change suddenly. Dominic mentioned trust, that's still an outstanding factor. Liesje talked about the tariffs, which are still in place and will need to be built down. Ricardo talks about the information bubbles that still persist. But I do think that we can be optimistic in saying that hopefully we will win back our European partner in terms of democracy promotion, in terms of business, digital and trade. So I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, all of our speakers and participants. For those who want to delve a bit further into the topic of transatlantic relations, we have another ELF event which is taking place now. My colleague Andre will put the link in the chat for you in case you want to jump over. And otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you at our next On the Agenda webinar, which will be on the 26th of November. Same time, same place, and we'll be talking about the EU's Green Deal and the implications of that. So thank you very much to everybody and have a lovely day.